The sun had just begun its descent behind the hills when Evelyn Carter heard the sharp knock at her door. Her homestead, sitting on the edge of a dusty settlement in the New Mexico Territory, rarely saw visitors after dark and never from strangers. Clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, Evelyn approached the door cautiously, a small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. After all, she was a lone woman on the plains, and caution had become second nature. When she opened the door, what stood before her made her heart leap not in fear, but in confusion. A tall Apache warrior stood barefoot on her porch, his clothes torn and stained with blood and dust. He was gaunt, bruised, and clearly injured. But what drew her eyes wasn't the man, it was the small bundle in his arms. A baby, barely a few weeks old, weakly crying, its lips parched and skin pale. The warrior looked straight into Evelyn's eyes. He didn't speak at first. He simply held out the child, desperation bleeding from every gesture. Evelyn's first instinct was to slam the door. Every newspaper, every town meeting, every frightened whisper in the general store warned against savages. She had heard stories of raids, of murders, of women taken. And yet, this man did not look like a threat. He looked like a ghost of war, broken and begging. Through choked words and trembling hands, the warrior tried to speak. His English was broken, but one word came through clearly, again and again: milk. At first, Evelyn didn't understand. Then she looked at the baby again, its tiny mouth searching, its cries weakening. Her heart sank. The child was starving. Her own baby Noah had passed just 3 months ago. A fever took him too quickly for doctors or prayers. Her breasts, though softer now, still produced milk, something that had been a lingering burden, a painful reminder of her loss. She had cursed her body every morning for continuing a duty it no longer needed to perform. But now she hesitated. Letting a native man into her home could make her a target. Her neighbors would never understand. But how could she look into that baby's face, remember her own son's final cries, and do nothing? "Come in," she whispered, her voice unsure but resolute. The warrior bowed slightly. As if understanding the magnitude of her risk, he stepped inside slowly, shielding the baby with his body. Evelyn locked the door behind them, her hand still trembling. She lit a lantern and guided him to the wooden bench beside the hearth. The cabin was modest, one main room with a fireplace, a bed in the corner, and shelves lined with herbs and linens. She took the baby gently from the warrior's arms. The child was light, frighteningly so. As she unwrapped the swaddle, she saw bruises along its tiny legs, nothing malicious, just the wear of travel and hardship. The warrior watched closely, breathing heavily, his hand near a small knife tucked in his belt, not as a threat, but as a protector unsure of this new territory. Evelyn sat in the rocking chair beside the fire. She loosened her blouse and brought the baby to her breast. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the child latched on, and a soft, desperate suckling began. Evelyn felt her heart crack open. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain or even joy, but from the overwhelming grief and comfort that surged together in that one moment. The baby nursed greedily, making soft noises as it filled its belly. Evelyn rocked gently, her eyes locked with the warrior's. He was silent, but his face softened. The hardness around his jaw eased, and his shoulders dropped. He placed a hand over his chest, nodding once in what she understood as gratitude. "Dakota," he said, pointing to himself. "Evelyn," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. Then he touched his heart again and pointed to the baby. "Little Fox," he said, "sister gone, cavalry." Evelyn's breath caught. Gone? Killed? Her mind reeled. The child had no mother. And now this man, this warrior, had come begging not for revenge, not for shelter, but for life. 4. A child who had no one else. The room fell into silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of little Fox feeding. Evelyn glanced down at the baby and then up at Dakota. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. The world had brought this man and this baby to her doorstep for a reason. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. The morning after the Apache warrior arrived at Evelyn Carter's doorstep was unusually still. A pale mist hung low across the fields, blurring the edges of the world outside her cabin, as if it too were unsure what to make of the stranger now resting inside. Evelyn rose early, like she always did, but today her movements were different, careful, deliberate, touched by something sacred. Little Fox slept peacefully, wrapped in fresh linens and nestled in the cradle Evelyn's late husband had built before their son was born. The sight of the baby, now warm, clean, and full, brought a mix of emotions Evelyn didn't yet know how to name. A part of her felt alive again. Another part still grieved the emptiness she'd carried since Noah's death. But something about this child, this fragile life passed into her arms by an enemy-turned supplicant, had pierced through the thick wall of mourning around her. Dakota sat across the room on a woven mat, watching quietly. Though clearly exhausted and still nursing wounds, he remained alert, his gaze constantly moving between Evelyn and the cradle. He hadn't slept much. She suspected it was habit, years of surviving with his back to the wall, never knowing when danger would come. Evelyn brewed tea and approached him with a tin cup. "It's chamomile," she said softly. He took it with both hands, nodding again. "Chamomile," he repeated slowly, doing his best to mimic the unfamiliar word. Then, tapping his chest gently, he said again, "Dakota." He pointed to her, raising his brow with a small smile. "Evelyn," she answered, touching her collarbone. He said her name once, softly, "Eveline." She was surprised by the warmth in his voice. It was the first time he spoke without strain, without urgency. In that moment, he sounded like any man, not a warrior, not a threat, just someone trying to stay human in a world that kept trying to strip that away. As the day passed, Evelyn cleaned and redressed Dakota's wounds. He had a deep gash on his side and another on his leg, likely from a rifle or saber. He bore the pain with stoic silence but didn't flinch at her touch. It struck her how little he resisted help, how much he entrusted her, even after all the reasons he must have had to distrust white settlers. She didn't ask for details. His eyes had already told enough stories of fire, betrayal, and running through the night with a dying child in his arms. When little Fox stirred again, crying softly from hunger, Evelyn instinctively gathered the infant to her breast. The act no longer felt strange or shameful. It felt necessary. Like the earth itself had willed this reunion of loss and hope. Dakota watched her feed the child, but this time there was something different in his gaze. No longer just gratitude, there was reverence and perhaps something deeper. A recognition. He didn't see her as a settler woman anymore. In that moment, she was a life-giver, a healer, a mother. "Milk," he said again, gently, as if the word were holy. "Strong, spirit stay." She glanced up at him, unsure of the meaning, but her heart stirred. "You think the baby will live?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Milk is life, spirit stay and baby, because mother give." Evelyn swallowed hard. She wasn't this child's mother. But the way Dakota looked at her said otherwise. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Later that day, Evelyn wrapped little Fox in a blanket and stepped outside to hang the wash. She paused, surveying the land. It felt more exposed now, her tiny farm, her home, her choices. She knew that if anyone from the town learned she had taken in an Apache, she would be ostracized, possibly worse. They didn't see nuance or desperation. They didn't see warriors with bleeding babies. They saw enemies. And no one would care that Dakota had come not with weapons, but with a plea dot. As she returned inside, she found Dakota holding the baby cradling. Little Fox close to his chest, humming in his native tongue. The song was low, rhythmic, ancient. Evelyn didn't know the words, but the emotion in them filled the room. She sat near the hearth, listening quietly as the baby drifted back to sleep. I sing? Sister song, he said when he noticed her watching. It's beautiful, she replied. He looked at her for a long time, then spoke slowly. Sister, gone. You? Mother now. Evelyn's breath caught. She wasn't ready for those words. But part of her, perhaps the part still holding her son's memory, knew they were true. She hadn't chosen to become this child's mother. But neither had Dakota chosen to carry a baby across barren land, bleeding and hunted, begging for a kindness that could so easily have been refused. And yet, here they were, two wounded souls, stitched together by milk, mercy, and the tiny heartbeat of a child who refused to die. The days that followed brought an odd kind of stillness to Evelyn Carter's world, not peaceful, but suspended, like the hush that hangs before a storm. Inside her cabin, there was a rhythm slowly forming. Dakota would rise early, sometimes, before dawn, and step outside to watch the hills, always alert. Evelyn would tend to Little Fox, whose cries were now louder, stronger, his color returning with each feeding. It was as if life had dared to return to her home, quiet and trembling but determined to stay. Though Dakota rarely spoke, he watched everything, how Evelyn mixed herbs into warm water to help with the baby's digestion, how she cleaned and stored his old baby clothes, how she kept one hand near the shotgun by the hearth whenever she went to answer a knock at the door. He seemed to understand the risk she was taking just by letting him stay. And Evelyn, in turn, came to understand more about him through the silence they shared. They sat together in the evenings, her sewing or rocking Little Fox, him whittling or sharpening his blade with quiet precision. Over time, Evelyn began teaching Dakota English words, writing them out on scraps of paper, slowly sounding them out with him. In exchange, he taught her Apache phrases. He told her the name of every bird call they heard at dusk, every herb she had growing in her garden. For every word he learned from her, he gave one back. There was something sacred in the trade language becoming the bridge where trust could walk. Still, there were questions Evelyn wanted to ask but didn't know how. What had happened to his sister? What had they run from? Why had he come so far, risking everything for a child? But she sensed those answers lived in wounds that hadn't closed yet, and pushing too soon might tear them open. One night, after the baby had fallen asleep and the fire had burned down low, Evelyn dared to ask, "Why did you come to me?" Dakota was sharpening a piece of wood into a toy for the baby. He paused. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he lifted his head and looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of aching clarity. "I knew white woman live here," he said slowly. "They say she lost baby, buried him by the hill." Evelyn's breath caught. "Who told you that?" "A boy from town. He throw rocks at me. But he say, woman who cry at night, alone, has milk." Her eyes welled unexpectedly. The idea that her mourning had echoed loud enough to be known by strangers, by children throwing stones at shadow, stung. "I was desperate," he continued. "Little Fox, no eat, no cry. Like ghost already, I thought. Maybe she hate me. Maybe she shoot me. But maybe." He paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe she remember how to love a baby." Evelyn lowered her head. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and silent. She remembered that first night, the hollow ache in her chest, the way the baby had latched like he'd known her. She remembered her son's final breath, his tiny body going limp in her arms, and how the world had kept spinning like nothing had happened, Dakota's voice softened. My sister. Her name was Nita. She was kind, soft like you. But she fight. When soldiers came, she hide the baby. They shoot her anyway. He stared into the fire, jaw tight. I find her after. She was already cold. I take the baby. Run. Evelyn reached over without thinking and placed her hand gently on his. He didn't move. Their hands sat together on the table, hers pale and small, his large and calloused, scarred from years of fighting. That one touch, that human contact, said everything words couldn't. The next morning, Evelyn placed a fresh wooden cross at her son's grave, just over the hill behind the cabin. But this time, she didn't cry alone. Dakota stood beside her, holding little Fox. They said no words, none were needed. Back at the cabin, Evelyn found herself thinking about Nita. What had she been like? What dreams had she carried before the world tore them away? Evelyn began sewing a small quilt for little Fox, threading it with old fabric scraps, each square a story, some hers, some she imagined were Nita's. She asked Dakota for stories about his sister, and he told them slowly, piecing her memory together from firelit nights and childhood songs. In this shared silence, this stitching of grief and survival, a new kind of family was being formed. Not by blood or vows, but by mercy, loss, and the life of a child who somehow had called them both back from the edge. Evelyn Carter was no stranger to whispers. Since her husband's death, she'd learned how quickly gossip traveled in town, especially about a widow who chose to live alone on the edge of nowhere. But now the whispers weren't just about her strange, solitary ways. Now they were about an Apache she heard at first at the general store in town. She'd left Dakota and little Fox at the cabin and ridden in to pick up flour and lamp oil. The moment she stepped inside, the conversation went still. A few women greeted her with forced smiles, but most just stared. As she waited at the counter, she overheard a hushed voice behind her say, "Saw her hauling firewood with someone dark, not a drifter. Looked Injun to me." "Damn shame," another replied. "She's not right since that baby died." Evelyn didn't flinch. She paid for her goods, nodded to the shopkeeper, and left with her chin high. But her hands trembled on the reins all the way home. That evening, she sat by the fire, watching little Fox sleep while Dakota sharpened his blade on a stone. She hesitated, then said softly, "They know." Dakota didn't look up. "I know. They saw you, or think they did. They'll come." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the fear growing inside her. Dakota finally looked at her. "Then I go. Tonight." "No." The word came out sharper than she meant. She took a breath. "I didn't help you just to watch you die out there." He tilted his head. "You risk much. For me, for baby." She stood and moved to the cradle, gently brushing a strand of hair from little Fox's forehead. "You're not just some stranger anymore. This child. He's not just yours now. He's mine too." Dakota nodded slowly, understanding more than her words alone conveyed. He had seen this bond forming between Evelyn and the child, between Evelyn and himself. It wasn't love, at least not the kind he'd known before. It was something deeper, a shared burden, a promise unspoken. 2 days later, the real threat arrived. It was just past midday when Evelyn saw dust rising in the distance. 4 men on horseback riding fast. She grabbed her shotgun and opened the cellar door. "Dakota," she said firmly. "Go." He didn't argue. He took little Fox, wrapped him in a blanket, and disappeared into the darkness below the floorboards. When the riders arrived, they didn't bother with pleasantries. One was the sheriff, flanked by 2 ranchers and a deputy. All of them carried rifles. "Evenin', Miss Carter," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "We've had some talk around town. Folks are saying they seen someone a redskin lurking round your place." Evelyn forced a smile. Haven't seen a soul out here but jackrabbits. Town's got too much time to talk. One of the ranchers, a tall man with a long scar on his neck, narrowed his eyes. You sure about that? Neighbor said he saw footprints. Big ones. Then he ought to mind his own damn field, Evelyn replied coldly. You want to search my land, you'll need a warrant. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. Where? Just checking in. See, a patrol went missing last week. Some folks think your guest might have had something to do with it. My guest is the wind, she said, gripping her shotgun tighter. Now, unless you plan to trample my crops or spook my chickens, I suggest you ride on. The men exchanged glances. The scarred rancher looked like he wanted to press the matter, but the sheriff raised a hand. We'll be back, he said. With papers. They turned and rode off. Evelyn waited until the dust settled before she opened the cellar. Dakota emerged with Little Fox, who had slept through it all. But Evelyn's hands were still shaking. We can't stay, she said. Her voice barely above a whisper. Dakota nodded. Then we go. That night, by candlelight, they packed what little they had. Food, blankets, a map. Evelyn dressed in her husband's old clothes, wrapped Little Fox close to her chest, and loaded the mule. As they stood at the edge of the woods, the cabin behind them silhouetted against the moonlight, Evelyn looked back once. It wasn't just a house she was leaving. It was safety, reputation, the only life she'd known. You ready? She asked. Dakota didn't answer. He just reached out and took her hand, not tightly, but enough to let her know they were no longer walking alone. And with that, they disappeared into the wilderness, chased not by soldiers or outlaws, but by the whispers of war. The forest swallowed them quickly. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, Evelyn Carter was miles from the home she had known for the last 5 years. Gone was the neat little cabin, the herb garden, the grave she visited daily. In its place, endless trees, winding trails, and the constant rustle of something unseen just beyond the brush. The world had narrowed to survival. Takeo Day led the way. Moving with quiet confidence through terrain Evelyn found both beautiful and cruel. The land was not unfamiliar. She'd walked its edges before on short foraging trips, but now every branch and shadow held danger. She followed closely, one hand holding the reins of their mule, the other wrapped protectively around the small bundle tied to her chest. Little Fox. The child stirred only now and then, his body warm against hers, his breathing steady. He was thriving, no longer the ghost of a baby that had come to her days ago. His cheeks had color, and his limbs held strength. He was a reminder, in every breath and squirm, of why they were running, why they couldn't afford to slow down. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in thick brush or sheltered caves. Evelyn learned quickly how to listen for distant hooves, how to tie pine boughs together for cover, how to move silently. Dakota taught her how to read the trees and smell smoke on the wind. She watched him closely, mimicking his methods. Despite the fatigue, there was a strange calm in their rhythm. It was as if danger, instead of dividing them, had drawn them into a sacred alignment: warrior, healer, child. Each day carried its own threat. At one point, they had to hide in a dried-up creek bed for nearly half a day while a group of bounty hunters passed through the area. Evelyn held her breath as the men passed just feet above their hiding spot, laughing and boasting about the price being offered for one wild Apache and the fool white woman protecting him. That night, around a small fire hidden behind a boulder, Evelyn finally let her fear speak. What if they catch us? Dakota didn't answer immediately. He was stirring a pot of roots and dried meat, his eyes focused on the flames. Then he said quietly, They already catch too much. Land, spirit, my sister, your son. She looked up, startled. You and me, he said, tapping his chest and then pointing to her. We still breathing. "We not caught yet." Evelyn couldn't argue with that. She was still standing, still fighting. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving for herself. She was surviving for little Fox, for the memory of Dakota's sister. And maybe, just maybe, for a future that had a place for all of them. Days blurred into one another. They crossed rivers, slept beneath stars, and huddled through summer storms. They foraged for berries and caught fish with traps Dakota made from reeds and vines. Evelyn had never known this life raw, untamed, constantly moving, but she didn't resent it. There was something honest about it. The land did not lie. It asked everything from you, but it gave back in return. Clarity, freedom, strength. One evening, as they rested in a hollow beside a ridge, Dakota showed her how to shoot a bow. She was clumsy at first, but after an hour, her arrows started to hit closer to the mark. He smiled at her small victory, a rare thing that lit his whole face. That night, they laughed real laughter when little Fox refused to let either of them sleep, crying until Dakota sang to him in Apache and Evelyn rocked him with exaggerated bounces. It wasn't all hardship. There were moments of unexpected joy, too. One morning, Evelyn woke to find a necklace made of woven grass and feathers lying next to her bedroll. Dakota didn't say it was from him, but she knew. She wore it proudly, not as a decoration, but as a badge of trust, of kinship, of a promise silently spoken between them. Still, they could never fully relax. Every fire was extinguished quickly. Every trail they left behind was swept clean. Dakota estimated they had a few more days before reaching his people hidden deep within a canyon range where the cavalry dared not tread. But the closer they got, the more Evelyn's heart beat with both hope and dread. What if they didn't accept her? What if she had come this far only to be rejected by the very people Dakota called family? One night, as the moon cast silver over the earth, Evelyn whispered, "What if I don't belong there?" Dakota looked at her for a long time, then placed a hand over her heart. "You belong where the child lives," he said simply, and just like that, her fears were quieted, not erased, but hushed by something greater, purpose. They continued their journey through the wild, no longer just fugitives or survivors, but a small, strange family bound by loss, trust, and a tiny heartbeat that would not give up. It was the 14th day of travel when Dakota finally said, "We are close." His voice, as always, was steady, but Evelyn sensed something underneath: anxiety, maybe even doubt. They had crossed rugged terrain, forded rivers, evaded armed riders, and now stood on the brink of their journey's purpose, the hidden homeland of Dakota's people. A place Evelyn had only heard about in hushed tones and hostile stories. A place she had no idea if she'd be welcome. The land began to change. Trees thinned into rocky hillsides, and the air turned dry and sharp with sage. Dakota moved faster now, as if his feet knew the way without his eyes. Evelyn followed close behind, cradling little Fox, whose bright eyes darted around with curiosity. The baby had grown stronger, his skin full of warmth and his body no longer frail. She had saved his life. But now, as they neared the Apache camp, she wondered if she would have to give that life back. As they descended into a narrow ravine shaded by towering canyon walls, Evelyn saw the first sign of life: two young warriors, faces painted and bows drawn, standing silent in the shadows. Dakota raised a hand, uttered something in Apache, and the warriors lowered their weapons slowly, though their eyes never left Evelyn. She gripped the baby tighter. One of the guards ran ahead. The other motioned for them to continue. Within minutes, the canyon opened into a hidden valley, a small encampment nestled into the rock like it had always belonged there. Smoke curled gently from low fires, and women turned to look as Dakota walked into the camp. Then the whispers began. The return of a warrior was cause enough for attention, But a white woman carrying a native child? That was something else entirely. Dozens of eyes fell on Evelyn. Some were wide with shock. Others narrowed with suspicion. One woman crossed herself and pulled her children behind her. Evelyn kept her head high, her feet steady, even as her heart thundered in her chest. An elder emerged from one of the larger lodges, tall, thin, wrapped in a faded red shawl embroidered with bird feathers. Her hair was white, braided down her back, and her eyes were clouded but sharp with wisdom. She approached Dakota slowly, touching his arm with a tenderness that spoke of deep connection. "My son," she said in Apache. "You return." "I return," Dakota replied, bowing his head. "With the child, little Fox, my sister's son." The woman's face tightened with emotion. She reached forward and gently touched the sleeping baby's cheek. "And the woman?" she asked. Tko stepped aside. "This is Evelyn. She gave milk. She kept him alive." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads. One man spat at the ground. But the elder remained still. Evelyn braced herself. The elder turned to her and studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Then she placed a hand on Evelyn's chest over her heart and said, "You carry mourning." Like a mother who has buried her young. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I have," she whispered, "and now I'm trying to keep this one alive." The elder nodded slowly. "She does not speak our tongue," someone muttered. "She is white," said another. "She will betray us." The elder raised her hand for silence. "She has fed the child with her own body. That is no betrayal. That is life, and life deserves thanks." Still, there was tension in the air. She could feel it like heat on her skin. She didn't belong, not yet. Over the next days, Evelyn was allowed to stay, but not as a guest. She was given tasks, chores, that tested her hands and her patience. She fetched water from distant streams, gathered firewood, helped grind corn, and mend clothing. It was a trial of sorts, not spoken, but clearly felt. The tribe was watching, waiting, measuring her worth. She did everything asked without complaint. One night, after she treated a child's fever with a tea of wild mint and willow bark, a woman said quietly, "She knows healing. Maybe the spirit sent her." The elder, whose name Evelyn learned was Shima, began speaking with her more. They shared stories, Shima through Dakota, who translated with growing ease. Evelyn learned of Nita's death, the betrayal of the treaty, the years of hardship. And, in return, Evelyn spoke of Noah, her son, and how grief had nearly drowned her before little Fox brought her back to life. Bit by bit, walls softened. Children began playing near her. Women began nodding and greeting. She was not yet one of them, but the label of outsider had begun to fade. Then, one morning, Shima stood before the tribe and said, "This woman nursed our blood. She took in our sorrow. The child calls her Aina mother. The spirits watch, and they have not turned away." That night, Evelyn sat by the fire with Dakota and little Fox curled asleep in her arms. Overhead, the stars glittered bright and cold. She had crossed into another world, not by birthright, not by invitation, but by action, by mercy, by the milk that had tied her to a baby and to a people who were slowly learning that the lines between enemy and kin were not as unbreakable as they'd once believed. Peace, Evelyn had learned, was not a promise, it was a breath, fleeting, fragile, and in the Apache camp nestled deep in the canyons, peace lived from one day to the next, quietly, always glancing over its shoulder. For a time, that breath held. Days became weeks. Evelyn settled into a rhythm she never imagined for herself, gathering roots with the elder women, weaving baskets, feeding and caring for little Fox while he learned to walk, laugh, and speak his first words in 2 languages. The Apache people still watched her, but with softer eyes. Children followed her on camp, curious about her stories, her tools, her singing voice. The men nodded respectfully now when she passed. She had earned something, not complete acceptance, but space. She had become part of the rhythm. Tiekeo too changed. He no longer stood on the edges like a hawk ready to fly. He moved among his people with strength, but without the weight of grief dragging him down. He hunted again, taught the boys how to track deer. He became more than a warrior. He became an uncle, a brother, a guide. And each evening he returned to the fire where Evelyn and Little Fox waited. Without ever saying so, they had become his home. But even in the warmth of this new life, the past found ways to send its shadows. It started with a smoke trail thin and far off, drifting above the canyon rim. Then, days later, one of the scouts returned breathless with news. Cavalry patrols had been seen again, circling the outer ridges, closer than ever before. The army had not forgotten. They were searching. Shima, the elder matriarch, gathered the tribe beneath the full moon. "They come again," she said. "Not with treaties, not with peace, but with fire and hunger." There were murmurs of fear, anger, resolve. Takota stepped forward. "We cannot run forever. We must defend what we have." Some nodded. Others, older and wearier, looked away. Evelyn remained still, her arms around Little Fox. Her mind raced. She remembered the faces of the men who had come to her cabin. She remembered their threats, their hatred. And she knew if they found this camp, they would not spare anyone. Later that night, Evelyn sat beside Takota outside his tent. "There's another way," she said quietly. He looked at her. "If you fight, they'll use it as proof. See? Savages. Dangerous. Deserve to be wiped out. But if you don't fight, if someone stops them before they get here—" He narrowed his eyes. "You want to go to them? I want to delay them. Distract them. Whatever it takes to protect the people here." "You go. You might not come back," Evelyn exhaled. "I didn't come here to survive. I came here because a child needed me. And I stayed because I needed to belong to something again. If I can give him a life, it's worth the risk." Takota was silent for a long time. Then he reached forward, took her hand, and pressed it to his chest. "You have become blood," he said. "Not white, not Apache, just heart." At dawn, Evelyn left with nothing but a small bag, her medicine, pouch, and the hope that her voice might buy the tribe some time. She rode alone through the winding canyons, then through the open plains until she found the cavalry camp near the river bend. The soldiers were startled to see a woman ride in alone, dusty and sunburnt. She was recognized instantly, Evelyn Carter, the widow from the settlement who had vanished without a trace. Some stared like she was a ghost. Others reached for their rifles. "I come with a plea," she said, standing tall before the commanding officer. She told them the truth. Not all of it, but enough. That she had found a wounded Apache warrior with an orphan child. That she had helped them. That the people they hunted were hiding not for war, but for survival. She spoke of the mother who had died protecting her child. Of the elder women teaching her to heal. Of the child Little Fox who now had a future only if this war stopped before it began again. Some laughed. Some didn't believe her. But one officer, young, with kind eyes, listened. "You're asking us to turn a blind eye to a hostile camp," he said. "I'm asking you to recognize the humanity in people who are tired of running," she replied. By nightfall, a messenger was sent back to the main post requesting delay. Not surrender, not forgiveness. Just time. Evelyn returned to the camp 3 days later, battered but unharmed. When Little Fox saw her, he ran to her with wide arms and a toothy smile. She dropped to her knees and held him close. That night, Takota carved a new symbol on the wall of their shelter. A dove, wings spread, carved beside the wolf and the sun. For the first time, there was no whisper of war in the wind, only the breath of peace held in the hands of those brave enough to choose it. The seasons turned quietly after Evelyn's return. The high canyon winds began to soften, and the nights grew warmer. The Apache encampment, hidden from the rest of the world, felt like a place untouched by the chaos that raged just beyond the ridgelines. The cavalry never came. Whether it was the delay Evelyn had negotiated or simply a shift in their priorities, no one knew. What mattered was that, for now, the tribe was safe. Evelyn had never meant to stay forever. When she first followed Dakota into the wilderness, she thought it was a temporary flight from danger. But what had begun as refuge had grown into something deeper, roots that stretched into the lives of others, into traditions, into the soil itself. The people no longer saw her as a visitor. They called her White Dove, not just for the color of her skin, but for what she had done. Flown into danger unarmed, brought a message of peace, and returned with hope. Little Fox had grown strong and joyful. His legs were sturdy, and he was constantly running from tent to tent, giggling, collecting sticks, feathers, and pebbles as if they were treasures. He spoke in both Apache and English, often mixing the two in a way that made Evelyn laugh and Dakota proud. But what meant the most was what he called her, Ina, mother. He said it with a sense of certainty, as though there had never been anyone else. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, Evelyn would watch him and feel a stab of guilt. He would never know Nita, his real mother. He would never remember the sound of her voice or the scent of her hair. But Evelyn had made a vow without words the day she first fed him, that he would not grow up unloved, that he would never feel unwanted. And she had kept that promise. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the ridges, the tribe gathered for a celebration, a ceremony to honor the renewal of spring and the continuation of life. Fires were lit, songs were sung, and offerings were made to the spirits. There was dancing, laughter, and stories shared beneath the stars. Shema, the wise elder, called for silence. She stood tall, her voice still commanding despite her age. "This spring, we give thanks for survival," she said. "For children who live, for warriors who return, and for mothers who are born not from blood, but from courage." She turned to Evelyn, her eyes gleaming. White Dove did not come to us in peace. She came in sorrow. But from that sorrow, she gave milk, she gave love, and she gave back what death tried to steal. For this, we call her family. The tribe nodded in silent agreement. It was not a ritual of adoption, not a ceremony crafted from law or formality. It was older than that, an acknowledgement of spirit, of action, of kinship earned. Later that night, Dakota found Evelyn sitting alone, watching Little Fox chase fireflies with the other children. "He is strong," Dakota said. "Because of you." Evelyn smiled. "Because of us." They sat in silence for a while, the fire casting flickering shadows across their faces. Then Evelyn asked, "Do you think he'll remember all of this? His mother, the journey, everything we went through?" Dakota shook his head slowly. "Not with his mind, but in his spirit, yes. He will carry it, just like we do." Evelyn looked over at the child she had nearly lost in her own grief. She hadn't expected him to heal her. She hadn't even expected to survive. But this child, this orphan she had nursed from the edge of death, had done more than give her a purpose. He had returned her soul to her body. In the months that followed, Evelyn became a healer among the people. She learned the plants, the prayers, the songs. She still kept some of her own ways, writing in her journal each night, teaching children to read English letters, but she never tried to replace what was already sacred. She only added to it, like a new stream feeding into a larger river. Dakota continued to lead, but no longer as a man driven by vengeance. He led with vision now, with hope. His strength no longer came from fury, but from his ability to protect the life they had rebuilt. One day, a traveler asked who Evelyn was, where she had come from. Dakota's answer was simple. She is the mother the boy needed. And the mother I didn't know I needed, too. And Evelyn, for her part, no longer wondered where she belonged. She had buried one son and found another. She had lost everything and yet gained a family, a tribe, a name, a purpose. In a world once built on fences and fear, she had become something no one could take from her. A mother, a protector, a bridge between two worlds, and every night, as she tucked little Fox into his blanket, she whispered the same promise she had made that first night on the cabin floor. You are not alone. You will never be alone, not as long as I breathe.